XAMPP here. This will be episode number 2 of HN's IT crash course. In this video, we're just going to be going over a simple web development setup, and in this case, we're going to be using XAMPP or Visual Studio Code. The reason for using XAMPP is on Windows, it's just really simple to get going and get started, and everything is ready to go. You can also put XAMPP on Linux, or for the most part. And I mean, if you're on Linux, you might as well just install Apache though, or MySQL. But for everyone who's still stuck on Windows, in my case, I'm still using Windows right now. Anyways, sometimes I go over to Ubuntu for my daily, but I kind of like gaming sometimes, so that's why I'm on Windows right now. Anywho, yeah, we're going to be setting up XAMPP so that you get Apache, PHP, and MySQL all ready to go on Windows. And all you have to really do is go to Google, search for XAMPP, go to their download page, download the latest version here, so with PHP 8.0. There's no point in installing with an older PHP version unless you're, say, developing an older project or whatever. But if you're starting up a new project like you probably are right now, you're probably going to want to go with the latest PHP version, so say in a year or two you won't have to reprogram or make some changes so that your application will run on the latest PHP version. And you're just going to download and install. It's more or less self-explanatory. You're going to choose the default download location. From my experience, choosing a location that is not the default tends to not work out so well. So the default installation location for XAMPP is just c/XAMPP. And then for Visual Studio Code, basically the same thing. Search up VS Code, download. If you're asked to install anything extra along this, you don't need it. I think it's Bitnami or something. You don't have to install their tools for XAMPP. You can skip that. So once you have everything installed, you should have a folder looking like this in XAMPP. So C drive, XAMPP, and you're gonna want to look for XAMPP control.exe. If you want to be more adventurous, you can also use the bat files to start and stop things, but these days the control panel is stable enough that you can leave it running. It's not like the old days where the control panel would freeze and crash all the time and you just have to use the bat files, and that was its own headache back in the day. These days it seems to be okay anyway so far. So you're going to want to go ahead and start Apache and probably MySQL. For now we won't really be using MySQL, so you don't actually have to start it up. Just, you know how to start it up. It's in the XAMPP control panel. So all we've done here is basically start up a Apache web server and a MySQL server. These are software servers, just so people aren't too confused. There's, the hardware version of the server, which is basically just an overglorified PC with more dedicated hardware, and then there's the software version of a server. These days a server can be like anything, just hardware wise anyways. So what's to go over here? Let's see, there's Apache here. This is where your configs are. Around here, configs. HTTPD is your main config file. You can edit it with Notepad or whatever. I do like to use Notepad++ for just basic text editing. That's something you guys might want to consider for Windows. Unfortunately, I don't think you can get it on Linux. There are alternatives on Linux that are not so bad. Kind of not so bad. I'm a little disappointed in that. The Notepad++ needs to go onto Linux. It needs a Linux port really bad, like a functional one. They do have one. Anyways, enough about that. And then the other key location is PHP, and then you're going to want to go to the php.ini file. This is for if you have to change any settings for later down on the road, and for now you don't really have to worry about that. By default, the majority of PHP modules are enabled, so you don't really have to worry about that. When you do get to your production environment, you will want to only enable the PHP modules that you're using, and you do this for security reasons, because more PHP modules means that there's more code and whatnot, more people, more potential for bugs and thus security vulnerabilities or whatever, potential for your server to be hacked. Why you don't use production environment settings on a production server or on a public server or whatever, for the most part. You can always do bad practice whenever you want. Anywho, so let's start off with the folder structure. I just out of habit went to htdocs. This is the correct folder. htdocs is going to be where your root folder is, where you're going to be doing all of your work. And if you're on Linux, this is going to be var www htdocs, and Windows users, please pay attention to that, because when you go to deploy your scripts or whatever to a production web server, you're probably going to deploy it to Linux. So, 1 second here. I did just close that. Alright, new guest window. Localhost. So in your browser, you're just going to type in localhost. If for whatever reason you're Googling localhost instead of coming to this page, it's http localhost type thing. And by default, that will bring you to this dashboard folder. That might be a little bit confusing. You can sort of use this for some links. So XAMPP comes readily available with PHP-MyAdmin. And sorry, it takes a while to load. And by default, the root password is blank, so it goes right in. Just so you know, this is just a quick little bit of PHP-MyAdmin and whatnot. This is kind of what it looks like, database, etc. We'll go into MySQL much later on. In the next video, I think we'll be going over just starting with HTML. PHP info tells you some stuff about the current PHP installation, and we'll go into that later on. So I'm going to go here and switch to Visual Studio Code. If you're going to use your search, you have to type in Visual Studio Code. You unfortunately can't just type in VS Code. That would be nice, but it doesn't work in Windows 10 or whatever. So this is a little bit different. It's in a sense an IDE. It's not quite an IDE. You can like start debugging, etc. In our case, we're just using it as a text editor, so you can call it whatever you want. A lot of people will interchange IDE with like their editor or whatever as well. It's no big deal. IDE just stands for Integrated Development Environment or whatever. And unless you have like, I don't know, the web server integrated, it's not really integrated. So whoever really wants to not see about that. So yeah, it works a little bit different than you'd expect for opening things. The way you open things is instead of choosing a file, you just choose a folder. I think that's the best way to open up something. So in this case, I've already created a folder called EP02 for episode 02, and I'm just going to select that folder. And here we are in the IDE. I have a random folder here, which I'm just going to remove. We can start by creating a new file, and we're just going to call this index. Actually, let's just call this hello.html. Since whatever. We'll just call that hello, just so we have something in there. So like I said, the dashboard by default is like a folder up. So you want to go localhost / whatever folder you just created. Hopefully you created a folder or just EP02. One thing to note before we continue on is Windows is case insensitive and Linux is case sensitive. So for the most part, when you're naming a file or whatever, you want it to be all in lower cases. Folder, same thing. So that when you do transition from your Windows development environment to Linux, you're not going to run into those sorts of bugs and issues. Always lowercase on your web server files or whatever. Anywho, what I want to point out is by default on XAMPP indexes are enabled. which means that it will list all the files in your folder unless you have an index file in place. By default, well, it depends on how you configure your production server. This is not always the case, just something to keep in mind. And it is bad practice to leave your indexes open because people can just snoop around in the file names or whatever and, you know, just snoop around from the outside without, like, doing stuff that they're not supposed to be, potentially. Anyways, this is the folder we're working in. You can also just go new text document and then index.html. To get the dots, something you should be changing is your view, and then make sure file extension is enabled. If it's not, it just, like, I don't know why people would ever not have it enabled, but make sure it's enabled, index.html. Otherwise you can't edit the extensions, which is gross. So it shows up here right away in Visual Studio Code. One thing to note, Visual Studio Code actually does have Git integration, so it works very well with Git. If you're using, or if you're just opening up like the Git directory for anyone who has used Git before. Just, you know, quick interesting little fact. I was honestly, for the most part, back when I started, I just used plain old Notepad, and for the longest time I was using Notepad++. And I think only about the past year or so I actually switched to Visual Studio Code, which is so much better. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video, guys. So this is Hot Noob here. Please subscribe. In the next video, we will be going over HTML and whatnot.